Well, welcome to this session of Marco Rubio on the couch. Senator Rubio, I'm going to start with 3 R's: roll, rice, and rates. First of all, roll. How much of the Republican Party's future success runs through you?
Oh, I wouldn't analyze it that way. I think that I'm one of 100 senators, one of 45 Republicans. That's the right number, right? I know we lost a couple. And, Florida's an important state. I hope to be a meaningful role, but obviously we have a lot of very talented colleagues who have ideas as well. And I think that as far as the Republican Party is concerned, I wouldn't even couch it that way. I'd say that the limited government, free enterprise conservatism in America needs to, in my opinion, do a better job of applying our principles to the problems of the 21st century. And the logical home of that movement is the Republican Party. And we're going to have a national conversation that'll play itself out in governor's races and Senate debates and House debates, and I hope to be a meaningful contributor to that.
You're going to Iowa?
I am. Yeah,
yes, right, to see Governor Branstad. I mean, that puts you on the grid for 2016.
Well,
so that's why that's the genesis of my question about how much the Republican, because many people believe you are, if not a new exemplar, a potentially new exemplar of what the Republican Party needs to do to adjust to the political realities in sharp relief demonstrated last Tuesday.
Well, it's kind of some people to think that. My trip to Iowa has nothing to do with 2016. It has to do with Governor Branstad, and I accepted that invitation when I fully expected Mitt Romney to be the next president of the United States, and believed that in 2016 we would be working for his reelection. As far as the broader narrative that people say, look, I've got some ideas I want to share. I think my background, and I tried to talk a little bit about it at the convention where I grew up, gives me insight into what our party should be more about. And here's the way I would couch it, is I believe that what makes America exceptional is a vibrant middle class. Every country in the world has rich people. And sadly, every country in the world has poor people. But what has distinguished us is a growing, vibrant middle class that my parents were a part of. My dad is a bartender and my mom is a maid. And the fundamental problem America has today is that middle class is shrinking because our economy is not creating middle class jobs, and our people are increasingly unprepared to fill the middle-class jobs that are being created. And so we need to have an answer to that. We need to show how limited government and free enterprise principles can turn that around. And if we do, I think we'll be successful. And if we don't, I think we'll have more days like last Tuesday.
There's a fight brewing even before there's a nomination over Susan Rice, whether or not the president will nominate her for Secretary of State. Do you share Lindsey Graham and John McCain's antipathy to that nomination? And related to that, how much do you think that her role in Benghazi and what we don't know and don't know should play a role in her nomination, should it come, or the creation or lack of creation of a select committee to deal with that issue?
Well, the president has a right to nominate someone for that position. That's his job. Our job is to confirm that person, and he needs to nominate who he thinks will best do the job. And I have no prejudgment of anyone who he would potentially nominate. Obviously,
so you're not where McCain and Lindsey are right now?
Well, no, because I think if Ambassador Rice is nominated, we're going to have hearings, we're going to have meetings. She'll, go through the gamut of things that you do as a nominee. I think Benghazi will come up. What's very clear is that the Sunday after that incident in Benghazi, she went on, I think, 5 shows and said that this attack was not terrorist-related. Now, that question is going to come up, whether that was her judgment or whether that was the judgment of people that she was repeating. I think that's also going to flush itself out in hearings that we're having as early as today.
But you're open-minded on the question of whether or not that was neglect, incompetence, or just what she was told.
Correct. I mean, I think we need to know the truth. And I think if you're going to have a fair process to evaluate someone, you can't go in already having made up your mind.
Rates is the 3rd R. This seems to be the emerging fault line in the fiscal cliff negotiations to the degree they are occurring right now. The president said yesterday, emphatically, rates need to go up. John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, has put revenue on the table in the context of tax reform. Where do you fall on this? Yeah. And do you believe there is a way to avoid the fiscal cliff? Because the president said yesterday, oh yeah, I can see a scenario where we go off the cliff, and within 15 minutes the market fell 115 points.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's important to remember the fiscal cliff, the thing that we're reaching here at the end of this year, is a complete and total congressional creation in combination with
owned by both parties.
Absolutely. I mean, the sequester was a dumb idea when it came up with it, and it's a dumber idea today. And it was bipartisan dumb. So the people want bipartisanship, there you have it. And so it didn't make a lot of sense when they did it. And so the point now being that the fiscal cliff is a creation of the political branch, although we do have a big fiscal cliff that will eventually reach us if, the real fiscal cliff is a growing debt and no plan in place to deal with it. As far as the rates are concerned, look, I don't have a religious, spiritual objection to higher tax rates. an economic objection to it because of the impact it has on growth. And here's the things I would say about that. Number one is an enormous number of people, an enormous number of folks that would be impacted by raising rates on the top earners are not millionaires and billionaires. They are small businesses that pay on the individual rate. And the number of businesses that today pay on the individual rate versus the corporate rate is much larger than it was just a decade ago and beyond when rates were higher under Clinton and others. The second question I would say is, what problem are we solving? Why are you raising the rates? Ostensibly, according to the president, is because it helps bring down the debt. But the truth is that if you go forward with what the president is proposing, you raise about $80 billion a year in new revenue, which is about 7.5% of your annual deficit. On the other hand, we know it's going to have, we believe it's going to have, an impact on growth. And so the question becomes, what problem are you solving, and are you willing and are you prepared to wipe out some small businesses in exchange for 7.5% of deficit reduction potentially? I think that's a bad trade-off. And the last point I would make about it is the billionaires and millionaires that are going to be impacted by higher rates, they can afford to hire the best lawyers, lobbyists, and accountants in America to figure out how not to pay those higher rates. And the folks that are going to get stuck with that bill are the small businesses, the partnerships, the S corporations that cannot hire the lawyers to get them out of it.
In other words, you won't vote for something that prevents the country from going off the cliff if there are higher rates attached to it.
I'm not going to vote for anything that's not a solution. We need a real solution.
Define a solution for this.
A solution is policies that put in place economic growth. Economic growth, you can't cut your way out of this that we're in. You can't. You certainly can't cut your way discretionary spending out of this, and you can't tax your way out of this dilemma. The only answer to this dilemma is rapid and healthy economic growth, like the economic growth that we've had in other recoveries, which is a significant amount of growth over a period of time. For example, if economic growth after this downturn in the economy had hit its historical average, you would have been able to cut by half last year's annual deficit.
But as you know, one of the things that accelerated those growth spurts after recessions in the Kennedy and Reagan tax cuts is that the rates were higher. We dropped them in the Bush era, and we had general economic growth, but not staggering economic growth, not really impressive. We didn't have wage growth. We've had essentially 10 to 12 years of tax cuts, dividend, capital gains, and income tax rates. We had the payroll tax cut. We had the make work pay tax cut. We have 12 years of tax policy on the cutting side, and yet we don't have growth in job creation or wage growth like we've seen in previous eras.
Right, well,
doesn't that trouble you about the entire concept structurally of using rates as the means by which, the principal means by which to create higher wages and more jobs?
Well, I've never said rates alone are the only way to create growth. There are other factors that are in place in terms of why these jobs are not being created. I mean, the reality is globalization is real, and it has replaced a lot of the middle-income, middle-class jobs that Americans were once getting. A second function of that is many Americans don't have the skills needed to fill the jobs that are being created in the middle-income era. But what I would point to you is that even in the Bush tax cut era, we had historic increases in revenue to government. The problem is that they were offset by even more historic increases in spending.
By Republicans.
Yeah, absolutely. Republicans and Democrats contributed to that. I mean, if you have a rapid increase in revenue, but you use it to grow government, as opposed to pay down the debt and provide stability, you're going to wind up where we are today. So rates are a part of it. The predictability of rates, the affordability of rates are part of it. But there's also needs to be an examination of regulatory policy. I think we have to solve a number of other issues involving the economy. But ultimately, I think the second half of that equation is we need to figure out a way to empower our people with the skills that they need to fill 21st century middle-class jobs. And we have a lot of people, and they're not all kids. I mean, you have a lot of people in their late 30s and mid-30s. Look, my sister's a perfect example. My sister in her mid to late 30s had not graduated from college. She had 2 kids she was raising. She lived with us at home. And she was able to go back to school and get a degree that now allows her today, and then a master's degree, which allows her today to have a middle-income job, which is as an assistant principal at an elementary school. Government had a role to play. When she had student financial aid that was federally funded. And that's why I support student financial aid as a part of capacitation. But we have to ensure that we are educating and training our people so that they have the skills for these middle-class jobs to the extent that they're still being created. And then we have to figure out ways to stir economic growth so that those jobs are created and increasingly created in America.
There is renewed optimism now in Washington that immigration reform will get a serious look and may be something that is achieved in the second term of an Obama presidency. First, do you share that optimism? Second, in our conversation before we came out here, you gave me a very interesting assessment that there is sort of a misnomer or impression you think there exists about dealing with those who were here being the hardest part of the immigration debate. You actually believe getting immigration policy right on the legal front going forward is far more difficult.
Yeah,
Talk
so
about
let's go
both
back to
things.
1986, where Ronald Reagan gave amnesty to about 3 million people. The problem is, the reason why 3 million became 11 million people is because while they gave the amnesty, they didn't do a good enough job of fixing the legal immigration system moving forward. So it's an issue of supply and demand that Republicans should understand as well as anybody, and that is that if your economy is demanding 2 million people a year to fill 2 million new jobs at a certain level, but you're only allowing 1 million people to come in, and of those, only a third are employment-based, you have a supply and demand problem, and that supply of folks that need a job in Mexico or anywhere else in the world is going to meet that demand. So if you don't have a legal immigration system that matches those two things, we're going to wind up in the exact same spot we're in today within a decade as soon as the economy gets growing again. And the reason why that's complicated is because our legal immigration system is largely broken into two categories: employment-based immigration and family reunification. And the reality on the Democratic side is that labor unions, many labor unions, are not in favor of increases in employment-based immigration, and puts a lot of pressure. That's why you have 15 Democrats that voted against the deal in 2007, if I'm not mistaken on the year. And that's complicated because we've got to figure that out as well. But I'm a believer in family. My parents came here.
So what you're saying is the political
reunification.
tension gets applied on both sides of the legal question.
Absolutely.
Employment-based and family reunification.
Absolutely.
And neither can be satisfied?
I think they can be satisfied, but we have to...
What's that look like?
Well, I think, number one, I am committed to continuing a family-based system of immigration. I think that's important. I think it's a marker for success. Yeah, my parents came in 1956. And my aunt and my mom's sister and her husband were living here already. They're the ones that helped them find their first job and get stabilized, and the rest is a very positive history of a middle-class family that were able to leave their kids better off than themselves. I think America is a better country because people like my parents were able to come here. So I believe in that. But I also know that on an employment end, you know, especially once the economy gets growing again, we will need jobs in agriculture, in construction, and in other fields that will rely on some level on a legal immigration system that functions. And we're going to have to work that part of it out. The legalization of people that are here today is politically charged, but you either do it or you don't, and then you can argue about how to do it. The more complicated one is how do you fix future immigration and how do you set up a system of legal immigration? The last point I want to make, because not enough of this is said, is I don't know if folks realize 1 million people a year immigrate to the U.S. legally every year. There is no other country in the world that comes close to that figure. So we are still extremely generous when it comes to immigration, perhaps more than any other country in the history of the world. But we have a problem in terms of how it's done, and that needs to be reformed. And if you don't get that right, the whole thing falls apart.
Now, the exit polling data has told us something that I think many would find interesting. Not surprising to you, about 3/4 of Obama supporters wanted a path to legalization for those who are here. 50% of Romney voters also supported that. 43% opposed it. Do you think your party will change on that question? And do you think your party has, for better or for worse, possibly in your mind worse, been defined by those who have been obsessed with the idea, what part of illegal don't you understand?
Well, here's what I would say. I think that, unfortunately, conservatism has done an excellent job of defining what we're against, but not a good enough job of defining what we are for. And what we are for is a legal immigration system that works. And conservatism's always been about common sense. I mean, we do have 11 million people in this country that are undocumented. The causes of that are very different. About 40% of them are visa overstays. These aren't people that jumped the fence. They came here legally, and at some point that visa expires, and they didn't renew it. Others were brought here as children when they were 4 years old, and some don't even realize they're undocumented until they try to go to college. Others, quite frankly, came here because there was a job on the other side, and their family was starving, and they're going to do anything they can to feed and provide for their families. Some folks want to be here legally. They hired someone who said or claimed to be an immigration expert. They paid him a couple $1,000s. That person disappeared and did nothing with their paperwork, and now they're out of status. It's not 11 million people that are in an identical situation. Each has its own demographic set. And I think, look, I think that progress is being made on that reality and what needs to be done. I think you've seen some public comments to that effect. But I think it's also critical that whatever we do on legalizing folks that are here today is not done in a way that will incentivize folks to do that in the future.
Is it safe to say for the Republican Party, terms like self-deportation or the concept of deportation are completely politically nullified?
Well, as I said to you, I've said publicly before and backstage, it's really hard to get people to listen to you on economic growth, on tax rates, on health care, if they think you want to deport their grandmother. I mean, it's very difficult to get people to listen to anything else you're saying. So I think it's critical. I mean, there's just common sense involved here in terms of how you portray it. Policy matters too, but rhetoric is important. And I think I think you've seen a change in that tone, hopefully, among people around the country on this issue. That you can be for legal immigration. You don't have to be for amnesty, but you also need to understand that we're speaking about human beings. And I think when you know these people, which is, if you're in the Hispanic, if you live where I live, in the city of West Miami, where virtually everyone is Hispanic, and virtually all of my neighbors came from somewhere else not that long ago. I mean, I know people that are in this circumstance. I know people who love people that are in this circumstance. My kids go to school with kids who have grandparents or, uncles and aunts that are in this circumstance. You know them not as a statistic. You know them as a human being, a walking, talking person who is in pain and who came here because they were hungry and their kids were starving and their family was hurting. And they did what any parent would do when faced with that circumstance. They did whatever they had to do to provide for them. And you have to always remember that when we talk about this.
Before I let you go, because I know the Senate floor beckons, 2 questions. You have come to know the time clock, annoying though it is, the United States Senate. So tell us what you think the timeline is and what this audience should look for on the fiscal cliff negotiations and on immigration. Do you think if immigration is not a front and center issue by, let's say, July of next year, it's probably going to be something that's going to drift on? And what should we look for in the next 4 to 6 weeks on fiscal cliff?
And I know this is what a lot of Republicans are saying, but I hope folks will hear me out. I actually think the first decision has to be made by the president, and here's what I think he needs to decide. He needs to decide whether he truly wants to work on a comprehensive, big look at the entire issue of what this country faces with regards to our, the fact that our government spends more money than it takes in at an alarming rate with no plan in place to change that. Or are they better off playing it hard, allowing the fiscal cliff to happen, and then at that point, when tax rates go up on everybody, being in a more advantageous position? One of my Senate colleagues a few months ago in a speech in this city, and later on in other appearances, basically said that that was the wise strategy.
That'd be Patty Murray from Washington.
Let the rates go up on everybody, let the fiscal cliff hit, and then anything we do will be in a much more advantageous position to get our version of reform done. I think a better solution, realistic solution over the next 3 weeks is you're not going to reform entitlements and the tax code and regulations in a 3-week period. I think we need to avoid sequestration. I think we need to avoid tax rates going up on anybody. And then I think we have to have a very serious bipartisan conversation about how to get this country on the right track, because I'm telling you, if we don't get this thing figured out, markets are not going to give us any more time, and we are all going to pay a terrible price. And any hope we have of getting more people into the middle class will be wiped out.
And on immigration, real quick, what's it look like?
Well, that's going to take more time only because of the things I've outlined to you. I think the immediate one that I think we can solve, and I hope we will solve quickly, is the issue of these kids that are in this country in an undocumented status. For them, time is of the essence.
Give them a permanent solution.
Absolutely. And, we've worked on defining that because time is of the essence for them. They're trying to get to college. They're trying to get going with their lives. I believe, and I've said this repeatedly, that the issue of kids that are in this country, undocumented, is not an immigration issue. It is a humanitarian one. They are more like refugees in that sense than they are like illegal immigration folks, because they're here through no fault of their own. They've raised their entire life here, and they want to go on with their future, many of which we've spent thousands of dollars educating them. It behooves us to find a permanent solution.
Senator Rubio, the Senate floor beckons, as do votes. Thank you very much for your time. I know this audience appreciates it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.